This is Curious Minnesota, a Star Tribune project that sends staff from the state's largest newsroom hunting for the answers to great questions we receive from you, our readers. We're here to answer everything you want to know about the state's people, places, and culture.
Welcome to Curious Minnesota. I'm your host, Eric Roper. Today's episode of Curious Minnesota is sponsored by Primrose Schools. Let's start today's show with a question. If I asked you to name some prominent Minnesota inventions, what comes to mind? Perhaps spam, which we've discussed on this podcast, maybe Post-it notes or pacemakers. Reporter Brooks Johnson dug into this issue for Curious Minnesota and found so many interesting Minnesota inventions that he wrote 2 stories. Today's question comes from Curious Minnesota superfan Sharon Carlson. And side note, if anyone is wondering why we've answered so many of Sharon's questions, it is because reporters keep grabbing her submissions. I don't tell the reporters who submitted the questions until they're working on the story. Okay, here's Sharon.
I've always known that Minnesota is home to multiple Fortune 500 companies such as 3M and Medtronic. And we're an outdoorsy state with so much to do, with so many outdoor activities. We've got great agricultural possibilities, and the people here tend to be highly educated with a great work ethic. So, inventions are just bound to happen.
Thanks to Sharon for that question. Here's my conversation with Brooks. Well, Brooks, thanks so much for joining us today. So first of all, tell us a little bit about what you do here at the paper, because you cover things relevant to some of the industries we're going to be talking about.
Certainly. I'm a business reporter. I cover the food industry, so General Mills, Hormel, Cargill, Land O'Lakes, those kind of companies, and also 3M, and a little bit of cannabis. 3M, of course, being a great example of a big inventor in this story.
Okay. And so before we get into the specific inventions, I think when we got into this, it was clear there was going to be a lot. We weren't going to be able to get to all of them. We ended up doing 2 stories. You did 2 stories. And so are we exceptional in this space? If people are going to people who aren't in Minnesota and they want to brag about our inventiveness, are we uniquely inventive, or what's the deal? What can we say here?
I think so. In business in general, Minnesota punches above its weight. We've got, 5.5 million people here, but so many different Fortune 500 headquarters, and that's part of the reason, we've got this inventiveness. We've got a diversity of industries from healthcare to food, and all these different sort of disciplines are rubbing up against each other and creating sparks, the spark of invention. And then, of course, the academic presence here in the state is a big reason for that, too. We've got the U, of course, but also private colleges all over. And that has led to just, really smart people coming out of Minnesota and some very interesting inventions, a diversity of inventions.
Right. So between these 2 stories, you came up with, and with some reader help on the second story, we invited people to sort of correct us or add to this, which was very helpful. But between those 2, you had about 20 inventions. We like to keep these episodes fairly tight, so we're not going to get to every one of them. We're going to list the ones we don't go to at the end of this conversation. But we're going to talk about 5 in particular today. The first one, which we're in our 30s, we grew up with this. Nerf is a really interesting one. I didn't expect that we would have Nerf as one of our Minnesota homegrown inventions, but tell us about how Nerf got going here in Minnesota.
Yeah, so it was a St. Paul advertising man and inventor, Ren Geyer, one of the men who came up with Twister in the 1960s. So he created the Nerf ball, and it was marketed as the world's first indoor ball. In the late 60s, one of Ren's employees was working on this sort of caveman or dinosaur era game featuring foam rocks. That didn't take off, but, Ren one day saw his employees throwing the ball around and thought, what if we just sell the ball? And so they went to Parker Brothers and they had this foam ball and said, hey, do you want this Nerf ball? And they bought it, and they've sold it ever since. We're 50 years on now since it came out in the 1970s.
Right. And so Nerf then sort of evolved into darts and all sorts of things. But there's the Nerf football is something a lot of people also grew up with, which obviously a sub-brand of Nerf then. But that's another Minnesota thing.
Yeah, and it was actually a Minnesota Vikings kicker we have to thank for the squishy Nerf football. That came out in 1972. It was Fred Cox, the kicker, and John Maddox. They went to a Minneapolis injection molder because Nerf, the brand, was having trouble doing it on their own. They tried every way to cut their regular foam into a football, but it kept getting holes in it, right? They couldn't get the shape right and keep it, consistent. But what they did instead was, take a mold and just, filled it with the material. And so it was was full. There were no like little holes in it. There were no defects. And so with Ren Geyer's help again, they brought it to Parker Brothers and they made it happen.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, again, fascinating. It's something a lot of us grew up with, and I didn't know it was from here. Another one a lot of us use every day, or at least some variation of it, I suppose. Soft soap. So we didn't invent liquid soap here in Minnesota, but Minnesotans did invent the sort of what brought liquid soap into the household, which is soft soap.
Yeah, so actually liquid soap dates back to 1865, but it didn't really take off. You didn't find it in anyone's homes before the 1980s.
There were no just bags or bladders of soap.
Right.
They needed a method to get it out, right?
Yeah, and so it was, the hand-pumped liquid soap dispenser, which you'll now find just about anywhere. I mean, before the 1980s, maybe in public restrooms, you'd see them on the walls, right? You press your palm in and you get your soap out, but in homes, it took Soft Soap, which was a subsidiary of Minnetonka Corp. here and entrepreneur Robert Taylor. So he came up with the idea on Soft Soap on a drive to work one day, according to Star Tribune archives.
And it was like replacing bar soap, essentially? I mean, that's what people were using?
Yeah, and so he thought, well, this bar soap makes a mess. People don't like leaving it everywhere and having to clean up after it. So why not, have a container for your soap and use liquid soap when you're washing your hands and going about your business. And of course, it was a $1 billion idea, literally. I mean, this is everywhere now. And so all the soft soap in the world was made in Chaska until 2000. But the company itself was bought by Palmolive, this big consumer product company, in 1987.
Okay. And I mean, there's a lot of liquid soap competitors. It's something other people manufacture, but soft soap remains sort of the top of the list as far as like the industry goes.
Oh, definitely. I mean, soft soap and then like store brand private label, right? So soft soap, for anyone who maybe isn't familiar with the brand or like the name itself, you definitely have seen the packaging before. It's those clear, transparent containers with aquariums in the back, right? You see the little clownfish or...
Are they always aquariums?
They look, not always, but that's sort of their most familiar sort of smaller size brand you see. So it's one of those entrepreneur stories of just like solving consumer problems, like I don't want soapy mess on my counter, so I'm going to put it in a bottle instead.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. Well, speaking of solving problems, so Scotch tape, this is probably not a surprise to most people who know that 3M is based here. Scotch's tape is a sort of a brand, and there's many different types of tapes. Let's talk first about sort of the masking style tape. Essentially like painter's tape is what we're talking about to some degree, right?
Yeah. So I mean, like paper with a glue on the back had been around for a bit, but not in a way that kind of worked for the industry. So Richard Drew worked for 3M. Originally, he had been a college dropout, played the banjo, and he never really wanted an office job, but he would go on to be a very famous inventor for 3M. He was working with a car company, and at the time in the 1920s, these two-tone cars were very, very popular, but the painters couldn't get it quite right. They wanted a really straight edge, but the tape they used at the time, it would peel off and it would take paint with it. So they'd have to do tiny touch-ups. It'd be very time-consuming, which is expensive.
Right.
And so he was tasked with trying to find a solution to that. 3M at the time was mostly just selling sandpaper, so this was kind of a new business for them. What he came up with ended up working pretty well, and it earned him some fame at the company.
All right, so masking tape is developed, but then they move on. The Scotch sort of brand then goes on to this other tape, which we now are familiar with, mostly kind of as gift wrapping tape or magic tape, something like that. What was that all about?
Yeah, so at the time, cellulose was a new product. I mean, it was this plastic film that hadn't really been around before.
And when are we talking here?
This is the late 1920s, yeah, and 3M's trying to find a good use for it. And they thought, well, let's try to put some of this glue on the back of it, right? Some of this adhesive. And they tried a couple different times, but Richard Drew, again, found a way to get the tape to work so that you, A, didn't see that there was adhesive on the back, right? It's transparent all the way through. And B, it wouldn't take off any of the paint or anything else after you apply it and try to take it off. And that was a really big hit for the company again. But it also happened, Richard Drew was working on his own time to make that happen. He was actually warned off of working on this and to focus on other work. But because of his ingenuity and his dedication to getting this across the finish line, 3M now famously has this 15% rule. So all their employees are encouraged to take 15% of their time and use it for independent projects.
Oh, okay.
Things that can come up with new inventions like this, right? That will define the company. Because to this day, Scotch tape is a huge, huge brand for 3M.
Right. And so Scotch, they even have like a tartan pattern on the branding. What is so Scottish about all this tape?
Well, it started as a diss, actually. One of Richard Drew's earlier sort of versions of masking tape. It didn't quite work well, and as a Smithsonian article put it, some choice profanity was thrown out when he brought this tape, and it did not work like he said it would. They called it Scotch, which at the time in the 1920s it meant, cheap or not well made. And so 3M embraced it, and they just put the Scotch name on everything. And to this day, that's still what they use for a lot of different products.
So this was sort of rooted in some sort of stereotype at the time about Scottish people.
Yeah, thriftiness and sort of just this lack of quality maybe that came along with it. So yeah, they meant it as a diss to say, this is cheap, get this cheap tape out of here. But they didn't want to call it, cheap brand tape. They called it Scotch.
Yeah. They don't want to call it like bad tape or whatever. We'll be right back.
At Primrose, our balanced learning approach means exploring academic skills and life skills, combining purposeful play with nurturing guidance from teachers, and setting children up for success in future classrooms. Learn more at primroseschools.com/Twin Cities.
And we're back. So here's another thing you sort of see every day and may not realize is local. Refrigerated trucks. The Thermo King brand is still on trucks all over the place, and you see refrigerated trucks all over the place. But this is another one that comes back to Minnesota. So tell us about Fred McKinley Jones.
Yeah, so it was the summer of 1938, and Fred McKinley Jones had been hired by a Minneapolis merchant to fulfill a promise he had made to a local trucking company. A man named Joseph Numeril said he could build a refrigerated truck that wouldn't fail like most of the ones at the time did. So, there were refrigerated trucks at the time, but they would fail when they went over bumps on the road or just they hit bad temperatures. They weren't very dependable. But it took Frederick McKinley Jones, who was later the first African American to be awarded the National Medal of Technology. It took him not too long to figure out how to do it with a compressor mounted under a trailer powered by a 4-cylinder engine.
Okay. And that sort of started Thermo King then, or?
It did, yeah, which still has a presence in the Twin Cities today. And so Thermo King went on to essentially define this industry. And so this technology is used in trucks, railroad cars, ships, and planes, and it revolutionized the way we eat in America and around the world. Before that time, before the late 30s, you'd be eating saltier foods if you wanted it from far away, or a lot more canned foods, or just fresh food from within 20 miles of you. So We're now able, because of this technology, to eat fresh produce year-round.
Okay. And in a different kind of convenience, we're also able to stand on some boats without falling off. Pontoons. Now, I had this debate once with people and listeners. You should debate this with the person next to you. Is it a pontoon or a pontoon boat?
Me growing up on the lakes of western Minnesota, Detroit Lakes, we called it a pontoon, just a pontoon.
Okay, the whole thing is a pontoon.
The whole thing's a pontoon.
I always thought, and maybe I'm wrong, I always thought it was a pontoon boat that had 2 pontoons underneath it.
See, I feel it's a catch-all term. Like, what I'm talking about when I say pontoon, right?
Yes, yeah. But anyway, we called them pontoons on the story, so I think that one won out. But those are local, so tell us about how that all got going.
Yeah, it was a Stearns County farmer named Ambrose Weirs, and he welded together some oil drums, put a flat kind of wood plank on the top, some rickety wood fencing on the sides, and called it a day.
When was that?
This was in 1952. So yeah, 70 years ago. And, people had tried something like this before that, but eventually, Weirs would turn it into a business, a very successful one at that. And folks all around were like, I kind of like this idea. This is some nice casual boating we get to do on these newfangled pontoons.
And he had a good quote kind of about what inspired this.
Oh, yeah. In his Star Tribune obituary, I loved finding this. He said, "Wouldn't it be nice if you could build a boat big and stable enough so you didn't have to keep telling the kids to sit down?"
Yeah, that's true.
I heard that a few times on the lake, even on a pontoon.
All right, and then let's get to our list of things that listeners, you should go check out in the stories that I'll link to in the show notes. Again, we just wanted to kind of keep it to a couple that we could discuss today. So some of the ones that are in those stories that are very impressive: GPS, that's a huge one. Tilt-A-Whirl, which we've all seen at fairs around. Pop-up toasters, another ubiquitous kind of kitchen item. Retractable seat belts. Frozen pizza. What are a couple others?
Yeah, well, let's talk about some other 3M inventions. I mean, you got Scotchgard. That was their first successful commercialization of PFAS. I mean, the forever chemicals that are now a big problem for them and the environment and human health. But Scotchgard was this stain-resistant product that essentially repelled water, repels oil. It's very useful, and it's become pretty troubling as a legacy. A few other 3M products include reflective road signs. So if you look at a stop sign, it's bright at night. That's 3M technology in there, little glass beads that reflect back at you.
Okay.
Yeah, a few other things. Rollerblades. We've got Twister, Zubaz.
Rollerblades and Zubaz seem to go together. Those are around the same. Are they the same period?
That's around the same period, yeah.
Okay.
And if you see someone rollerblading in Zubaz, you can be like, Minnesota made that possible. Yeah, we did that. We did that. Yeah.
Did you say skid steers?
No, Bobcat skid steers. That's a good one.
So skid steers and Bobcats was another one. After the first story, we heard from the inventor of the infant changing table. That was kind of a surprise, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And let's not forget water skis, too. I mean, what more Minnesota, land of 10,000 lakes, than water skis? It was a young man from Stillwater who came up with it and was long denied, actually, his due credit for being the inventor. But now there's a statue to him in his hometown.
And they just celebrated the century, the 100 years on that one.
Not
the centennial, as it were.
Yeah.
And then there's automatic elevator doors, which is out of Duluth.
Yeah, so it was a Duluthian named Alexander Miles who said, maybe elevator doors should automatically open and close when you get on and off an elevator. At the time, before the turn of the century, really, they were hand operated. You'd have to have someone, maybe it's the person on there, open and close the doors when you got on and off an elevator. So it's a big technology we still use today.
Right. And we'll close the show today with a strange one about how a cereal company developed a deep sea submersible vehicle. We don't have to get into the whole history, but what are we talking about?
We're talking about General Mills building a submarine for the Navy, the U.S. Navy. And this was in the 60s. And General Mills,
submarine with a fun name.
Yeah, Elvin, which would later visit the Titanic. That was in the 80s. But in the 60s, General Mills, because of its manufacturing prowess during World War II, was still a defense contractor. It didn't just make food. It did all sorts of industrial stuff at the time, and it's been in and out of lots of different businesses. And so it beat out, like Lockheed Martin and other defense contractors to build this, deep sea submersible, something that could go deeper in the ocean than anything that contained humans could before then, and it's still operating.
And this is what saw the first high-quality images of the Titanic, or what captured those?
Exactly. Yeah. And so that was a huge part of this story, and it's amazingly still operating and diving down to depths of more than 14,000 feet.
Wow. Well, we'll link in the show notes to those two stories so people can check out all those histories. And hopefully, listeners, we've armed you with some cool Minnesota inventions to go brag about to people, especially non-Minnesotans. If we need to convince of how great we are, just list a couple of these items off of this list. But Brooks, thank you so much for assembling this and for joining us.
You bet. Thanks, Eric.
Okay, that's it for today's show. I want to say thank you to listener Roger Kokeritz, who sent us a copy of the 1990 book Minnesota Trivia, compiled by Laurel Winter. Roger is a Minnesota native who lives in Taipei, Taiwan, and he says he enjoys listening to the podcast while riding the buses and metro in Taipei, which is so cool. Since he sent us the book, here's a trivia question from it that is slightly difficult to Google. If you record yourself reading the answer, we may feature it on a future episode. Okay, the question is, what town has been home to 5 Minnesota governors? Send your responses to curious@startribune.com. Thanks, as always, to Matt Gilmer for editing this podcast. Do you have feedback for us or a question you'd like us to answer? Send us a note at curious@startribune.com. And if you're enjoying this show, please tell a friend about it. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to Curious Minnesota. We want to hear from you. Ask questions and read more stories online at startribune.com/curious. Our show is recorded at the Star Tribune's headquarters in beautiful downtown Minneapolis, and our music is produced by Matt Gilmer. If you like the show, please rate us on iTunes or leave a review. And until next time, stay curious.